The November wind rattled the window panes of Thornfield Manor with skeletal fingers, as though the very bones of autumn sought entrance to chambers already cold enough to house the dead. Lady Eliza Hartwood, no, she must remember now. Lady Eliza Blackwell, Viscountess Blackwell, stood before the dying fire in what were now her private apartments, still clothed in the ivory silk that had bound her as surely as any shackles in this morning's brief, perfunctory ceremony. The gown hung heavy on her shoulders, each pearl button down her spine a separate weight, each yard of Belgian lace a reminder of the price paid for her. The room itself seemed to reject her presence. The walls exhaled dampness despite the fire's feeble protest. The furniture loomed in shadows that no candelabra could fully dispel, and the great four-poster bed stood like a monument to expectations that would remain forever unfulfilled. She had understood the terms, of course. Viscount Adrian Blackwell had required a wife to silence the whispers that followed his very public, very scandalous entanglement with Lady Cassandra Wentworth, whose husband had at last noticed her prolonged absences, and whose fury had threatened exposure that even Adrian's title could not fully protect against. Eliza had accepted his cold proposal in her father's study 3 weeks prior, the words delivered with all the warmth of a solicitor reading terms of foreclosure, because the alternative was watching her family descend into the hell of debtor's prison, watching her mother's gentle spirit break entirely, watching her younger sisters lose any hope of respectable futures. She had sold herself, though the transaction was dressed in legalities and blessed by a bishop who had stumbled over the words as though even he recognized the mockery being performed. In the distance, she heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, unhurried, distinctly masculine, and her breath caught in her throat despite herself, her body tensing in anticipation or perhaps dread. But the footsteps passed her door without slowing, continued down the hallway toward what she had been informed were the Viscount's private apartments in the western wing, and finally faded into silence that somehow rang louder than any sound. He would not come to her tonight, nor any night, she understood. The marriage would remain unconsummated, a legal arrangement only, her purpose served simply by bearing his name and appearing at his side when society required visible proof of respectability restored. I will not weep, she told herself, though her eyes burned with the effort of restraint. I will not grant him or this place or these circumstances the satisfaction of my tears. With fingers that trembled only slightly, she reached up to remove the diamond earrings that had belonged to Adrian's mother, a woman she would never know, whose memory haunted these halls more effectively than any living presence. The matching necklace followed, each piece carefully placed in the velvet-lined box that represented her bride price, the Blackwell jewels bestowed upon her not with love but with obligation, the ruby ring, too large for her finger, requiring adjustment she had not yet requested, the pearl bracelet, cold against her wrist these past 12 hours. One by one, she removed the symbols of her new station, each piece a link in chains made of gold and precious stones, until she stood divested of everything except the plain gold band that marked her as property and that she could not bring herself to remove. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let's begin. Morning arrived with reluctant grey light that did nothing to soften the austere formality of the breakfast room, where Eliza found herself seated at one end of a table long enough to host a diplomatic delegation, her husband positioned at the opposite end, as though they occupied separate continents rather than the same household. Adrian had risen before her, she knew not how early, having heard no sound from his distant chambers, and he sat now in perfect formal dress, his dark hair precisely arranged, his grey eyes fixed upon the newspaper before him with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts, though she suspected he absorbed not a single word. The silence between them possessed weight and texture, thick as morning fog, broken only by the careful footsteps of servants who entered and departed with the stiff formality of soldiers under review, their eyes downcast, but not before she caught the flickers of pity that crossed their faces when they glanced toward her. "I trust you found your apartments adequate," Adrian said at last, not lowering his paper, his tone precisely calibrated to convey polite indifference, as though she were a guest whose comfort mattered only insofar as it reflected upon his hospitality. Eliza set down her teacup with deliberate gentleness, though her hands wished to hurl it against the wall, to shatter something as her illusions had been shattered. "Quite adequate, my lord." The title felt strange on her tongue, formal and distant, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at the sound of it. He did lower the paper then, and she had her first clear view of him in daylight. This man, who was now legally entitled to every aspect of her existence, handsome, she could not deny, with the sharp aristocratic features that spoke of generations of careful breeding, a mouth that might have been sensual had it not been pressed into such a severe line, and those eyes, pale grey like winter ice, that seemed to look through her rather than at her. "We should establish certain understandings regarding the household arrangements," he continued, and even his voice carried frost, each word precisely enunciated as though he addressed a business associate rather than the woman he had wed less than 24 hours prior. "You will, naturally, maintain authority over the domestic sphere, the staff, the menus, any social obligations you deem appropriate. The East Wing has been prepared for your use. You'll find it contains everything necessary for your comfort. I occupy the West Wing, and my study is in the North Tower. Our paths need not cross except when social appearances require our joint attendance." Each sentence fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of humiliation through her chest, but Eliza maintained her composure, her face a mask of polite attention that revealed nothing of the degradation scorching through her veins. "I understand perfectly, my lord. You have purchased respectability, and I shall provide it." The terms of our arrangement could not be more clear. Something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or possibly irritation that she had stated so boldly what he had dressed in euphemism, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that impenetrable coldness. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, folding his newspaper with meticulous precision. "I must depart for London within the hour. Business matters require my attention. I expect to return within the fortnight." He did not ask if she had any needs, did not offer any gesture of comfort or companionship, and did not acknowledge in any way that he was abandoning his bride, of one day to face alone a household of strangers in a manner that radiated unwelcome from every stone. The servants had melted away, Eliza realized, retreating from the chill that permeated the room more effectively than any winter wind, and she was left alone at the absurdly long table, her breakfast congealing on fine china, the vast emptiness of Thornfield Manor stretching before her like a prison sentence. She spent the remainder of that day exploring her new domain, wandering through rooms that bore the faded elegance of past grandeur, slowly surrendering to neglect. Here a drawing room, where dust covers shrouded furniture like ghosts, there a music room where a pianoforte sat silent and slightly out of tune, everywhere the sense of a house that had forgotten what warmth meant. In the portrait gallery, she found evidence of the woman whose jewels she now wore. Lady Catherine Blackwell, captured in oils with gentle eyes and a smile that suggested kindness lived once in these halls, painted perhaps 20 years prior, before whatever tragedy had drained the life from this place. Asterisk, she was loved, asterisk, Eliza thought, studying the portrait. Asterisk, and her loss unmade this house. Asterisk, the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, appeared at her elbow like a summoned spirit, her lined face carefully neutral. "The late Viscountess, my lady, Lord Adrian's mother. She passed 5 years ago, come winter. The house has never recovered, if you'll forgive my saying so." Eliza turned to face the older woman, seeing in her eyes not pity now but something else, perhaps a question, perhaps the faintest spark of hope. "Then perhaps," Eliza said quietly, surprised by the steel in her own voice, "it is time the house learned to live again." She had been sold, yes, purchased to serve a purpose no more romantic than a business transaction, but she would not be defeated by these circumstances, would not become another ghost haunting these corridors. If she must live here, she would find purpose, would find meaning, would carve out existence that mattered, even if her husband never saw her as more than a convenience. The gold band on her finger caught the fading afternoon light, and this time, when she looked at it, she saw not chains but challenge to survive, to endure, perhaps even to transform this cold place into something resembling a home, even if she must do it entirely alone. 3 weeks passed in a peculiar suspension of time, each day bleeding into the next, with the monotonous grey sameness of November rain against ancient window panes, and Eliza had almost begun to believe that her husband had forgotten Thornfield Manor's existence entirely when she woke one morning to the sound of hoofbeats on gravel and looked from her chamber window to see Adrian dismounting in the courtyard, his greatcoat dark with road dust, his posture rigid with the same unapproachable formality he had carried to London. He did not seek her out upon his return. She had not expected he would, but from her various vantage points throughout the manor, she observed him as one might observe a rare and dangerous creature, noting the way he rode out alone each dawn when mist still clung to the grounds, pushing his black stallion to speeds that seemed less about exercise and more about escape, in his figure a dark slash against the pale morning, as though he sought to outrun something that pursued him relentlessly. In his absence, she had begun the work of reclaiming the manor from its own neglect, discovering that the household staff, who had watched her with such pitying eyes that first morning, were in fact hungry for direction, for purpose, for any indication that someone cared whether the silver tarnished or the linens yellowed in their presses. Mrs. Winters had proven an invaluable ally, her initial reserve melting when Eliza asked, not ordered, but asked for her guidance in understanding the household's workings, and together they had begun the slow process of restoration, opening shuttered rooms, beating dust from carpets, bringing reluctant life back to spaces that had been surrendered to darkness. The servants began to smile in her presence, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth, and she learned their names, their families' concerns, the small kindnesses that marked the difference between employer and tyrant. It was in the library that they finally spoke beyond cold formalities, 6 days after his return, when Eliza had sought refuge among the books, as dusk gathered and found Adrian already there, standing before the shelves with a volume in his hands that he did not appear to be reading. She nearly retreated, unwilling to intrude upon his solitude, but he had already sensed her presence and turned, and something in his expression, surprise perhaps, or weariness, kept her from fleeing. "I did not mean to disturb you, my lord," she said quietly, but she did not leave, and after a moment that stretched taut between them, he gestured vaguely to the shelves. "The library belongs to the household, not to me alone. You need not apologize for existing in your own home." The words were not warm, precisely, but neither were they dismissive, and emboldened by this minor thaw, Eliza moved to the shelves she had been frequenting, selecting the volume of Marcus Aurelius she had been working through, its meditations on duty and endurance, speaking to her current circumstances with painful relevance. She felt rather than saw Adrian's attention shift to the book in her hands, and when she glanced up, she found him studying her with an expression she could not quite interpret: curiosity, perhaps, or assessment, as though she had revealed something unexpected about herself. "You read philosophy?" he asked, and though the question might have been condescending from another man, from him it seemed genuine inquiry touched with something almost like surprise. "I read whatever helps me understand how to endure what must be endured," Eliza replied, meeting his eyes with deliberate steadiness, and she saw his jaw tighten, saw some emotion flicker across his features that might have been shame or perhaps recognition. He said nothing more, merely inclined his head in acknowledgement and turned toward the door, but she could not help but notice that he paused there, his hand on the frame, his profile to her, as though he wished to speak but could not find the words, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the gathering shadows and the strange, unsettled feeling that something had shifted infinitesimally between them. Later that evening, Mrs. Winters brought tea to Eliza's sitting room and lingered in the doorway with the particular hesitation of someone weighing whether to speak, and when Eliza gently encouraged her, the housekeeper's words came carefully measured. "The master seems different since your arrival, my lady. Oh, he's still keeping to himself, still wrapped in that coldness he's worn like armor these 5 years, but there's something I cannot quite name it, perhaps, an awareness that was not there before." Eliza set down her teacup, her heart beating strangely fast. 5 years, you said, since his mother's passing?" Mrs. Winters nodded, her lined face softening with memory and sorrow. "Lady Catherine was the warmth of this house, my lady. When she died, it was as though all the light went with her, and the late Viscount, Lord Adrian's father, well, he was never a kind man, but after her death he became something darker, something cruel, and young Lord Adrian bore the worst of it until the old Viscount himself passed 2 years later. The house has been cold ever since, cold as a tomb, and Lord Adrian has been like a ghost haunting his own life. The words settled over Eliza like a shroud, explaining so much the manor's neglect. Adrian's rigid distance, the sense of a man who had forgotten how to be human, and as she prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking not of her own loneliness but of his, wondering what it must be to live in a prison of one's own making, surrounded by walls built from grief and fear and the terrible legacy of a father's cruelty. December brought with it a winter storm of such ferocity that even the thick stone walls of Thornfield Manor seemed to shudder beneath its assault, wind howling through every crevice like the wails of restless spirits, and by the second evening, the temperature in the distant wings had dropped to such uncomfortable levels that even Adrian's stubborn determination to maintain his self-imposed isolation could not withstand the bitter cold that turned breath to mist and made sleep impossible. Eliza had retreated to the main drawing room where Mrs. Winters had ordered an enormous fire built, and she sat wrapped in a thick shawl attempting to focus on her book when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She had learned to recognize his particular gait, measured and controlled even in solitude, and then he appeared in the doorway, hesitating there as though he had stumbled upon foreign territory and was uncertain of his welcome. She looked up, and some traitorous part of her heart lifted at the sight of him despite everything, despite the coldness and the distance and the marriage that was marriage in name only, and she gestured toward the chair opposite hers with what she hoped appeared as casual courtesy rather than the pathetic eagerness she felt. "The West Wing must be uninhabitable in this weather," she said simply, and he nodded, crossing to the fire without meeting her eyes, lowering himself into the chair with a stiffness that seemed more than just formality, and for long minutes they sat in silence, broken only by the storm's fury and the fire's crackling, two strangers bound by law and circumstance, sharing warmth but little else. She tried to return to her reading. Truly she did, but her attention kept drifting to him, and it was thus that she noticed the way his hand pressed briefly to his left side, the way his breath caught almost imperceptibly, the tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain carefully concealed, and before she could stop herself, she was setting aside her book and leaning forward. "You're injured," she said, not a question but a statement, and he stiffened immediately, his walls slamming into place with almost audible force. "It's nothing, merely a bruise from riding. I require no assistance." But even as he spoke, she saw him wince again, saw the way he held himself with the particular stillness of someone whose every movement causes discomfort, and something in her, perhaps the years spent caring for younger siblings, perhaps simple human compassion, perhaps something more complicated she dared not examine, would not let her retreat into polite fiction. She rose and crossed to his chair despite his protest, kneeling beside him with a determination that surprised them both. "My lord, I am not a fool, and I spent enough years tending my brothers and sisters' various mishaps to recognize when someone has sustained more than a simple bruise. Now please allow me to see it, or I shall be forced to fetch Mrs. Winters and we can make a proper scene of it." For a long moment he simply stared at her, those grey eyes searching her face as though looking for some trick or hidden motive, and then with obvious reluctance he shifted enough to allow her access to his left side, and when she carefully lifted the edge of his shirt, she found exactly what she had suspected, a poorly bandaged wound, clearly from some accident, the surrounding flesh angry and inflamed, the bandaging inadequate to the injury's severity. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, calling for clean water and proper bandages, ignoring his continued protests as she cleaned and redressed the wound with a competence that seemed to surprise him into silence, and it was only when she had finished, when her hands had completed their work and she sat back on her heels, that he spoke in a voice roughened by something she could not identify. "Why did you accept my proposal?" The question hung between them, raw and unexpected, and she met his eyes steadily, choosing honesty over pride. "Because my father's debts had grown so substantial that without intervention, our entire family would have been sent to debtor's prison, my younger sisters, with no prospects and no future, and you offered a solution, however cold its terms." She watched something shift in his expression, respect perhaps, or recognition, or possibly guilt, and for a moment the walls he maintained so carefully seemed to waver, seemed almost transparent, and she glimpsed beneath them a man who carried burdens she could only begin to imagine. "I see," he said quietly, and then, with obvious effort, as though the words cost him something precious. "Thank you for your honesty, and for your capable ministrations. I am in your debt." He rose then, carefully testing his newly bandaged side, and despite the warmth of the fire, despite the storm that still raged beyond the windows, she knew he would retreat to his frozen wing rather than remain in this dangerous proximity where something almost like human connection had sparked between them. And indeed he was moving toward the door when he paused and turned back, his profile outlined by firelight. "Your family is fortunate to have inspired such loyalty," he said, and then he was gone, leaving her kneeling by the fire with her hands still warm from the heat of his skin beneath her fingers and her heart beating strangely fast in her chest, the impression of his vulnerability lingering like the ghost of something that might, given time and patience and courage, neither of them yet possessed, eventually become something more than this careful, painful distance. As January arrived with its particular brand of bitter cold that settled into bone and spirit alike, Eliza noticed with quiet surprise that Adrian had not fled back to London, as she had half expected, had not retreated into the distance that geography could provide when emotional distance proved insufficient, and instead he remained at Thornfield Manor, a restless presence moving through the corridors, like a man uncertain whether he was prisoner or resident, but unable to leave, regardless of which truth applied. An unspoken routine developed between them, with the peculiar inevitability of water finding its course, and each evening as twilight painted the windows grey, she would find herself drawn to the library, and each evening he would already be there or would arrive shortly after, and though neither acknowledged this pattern, neither broke it, and their conversations, while still brief and carefully measured, began to shift from mere civility toward something approaching substance. He asked her opinion on estate matters with increasing frequency, his initial inquiries hesitant, as though he expected her to have nothing of value to contribute. But she had spent her weeks of solitude learning every corner of the property, speaking with tenants and servants, observing with the keen eye of someone who understood that survival often depended on noticing what others overlooked. And when she mentioned the failing drainage in the eastern fields, or the concerns of the tenant families about the upcoming planting season, or the repairs needed in the servants' quarters that had been neglected for years, she watched his expression shift from surprise to something that might have been respect or perhaps shame that she had noticed what he had not. One evening in the library's golden lamplight, she found him standing motionless before the portrait of a woman whose gentle face and kind eyes marked her unmistakably as his mother, and the expression on Adrian's face held such naked longing and grief that Eliza nearly retreated to spare him the intrusion of a witness. But he had sensed her presence and turned, and for once he did not rebuild his walls, did not retreat behind cold formality. "She was everything good in this place," he said quietly, his voice roughened by emotion he did not try to disguise. "Kind and gentle and warm, everything my father was not. And when she died, it was as though she took all possibility of warmth with her, and he, my father, became something monstrous in his grief. Or perhaps the monster had always been there and she had been the only thing restraining it. I will never know." The words spilled from him as though a dam had broken, and Eliza stood very still, barely breathing, sensing that this moment was fragile as frost and might shatter if she moved too quickly. "He was brutal," Adrian continued, his eyes distant with terrible memory, "in ways both visible and invisible, and I spent my youth believing that such coldness, such capacity for cruelty, must be inherited, must run in the blood like a disease, and I have spent my adult life terrified that I would become him, that I would poison everything I touched." Eliza moved then, crossing the space between them with deliberate steps, until she stood close enough to see the fear in his grey eyes, the vulnerability he so rarely allowed anyone to witness. "Coldness is not an inheritance, my lord," she said gently but firmly, her voice steady with conviction. "It is a choice, made every day, in every action, and you have been choosing differently, whether you recognize it or not. I have seen it in how the servants no longer flinch in your presence, in how the tenants speak of recent kindnesses, in how you have remained here rather than fleeing." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, truly looked, and something stirred in the air between them, some recognition or possibility that had not existed before, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race and her breath catch, and she understood that they were standing at some threshold, though she could not yet name what lay beyond it. "Good night, Eliza," he said finally, and though he turned and left as he always did, his voice when he spoke, her name held a softness she had never heard before, and she stood alone before his mother's portrait, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably, the ice between them beginning at last to crack. The scandal sheets arrived from London on a grey February morning, delivered by Lady Pemberton, who called ostensibly to welcome the new Viscountess, but truly to be the first to share the delicious gossip that had set the ton ablaze, and Eliza knew the moment she saw the woman's eager eyes that whatever news she brought would draw blood. Lady Cassandra Whitmore, Adrian's former mistress whose existence had necessitated their hasty marriage, had announced her engagement to the Duke of Rothsmere, and the papers had seized upon this development with gleeful speculation, printing thinly veiled insinuations about Adrian's marriage being the desperate act of a rejected suitor, about Eliza being a convenient replacement purchase to soothe wounded pride, about the Viscountess who had been acquired like livestock to provide respectability while the Viscount nursed his broken heart. Lady Pemberton departed after delivering her poison with a smile, and Eliza stood in the drawing-room with the scandal sheets in her trembling hands, reading words that reduced her to a transaction and her husband to a lovesick fool, and though she had long known the practical nature of their arrangement, seeing it dissected for public entertainment brought a humiliation so acute she felt it as physical pain. She found Adrian in his study that evening, the same papers spread before him on his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and an expression of such weary resignation on his face that her anger faltered in the face of what looked remarkably like guilt. He looked up as she entered, and before she could speak, he rose and crossed to her, and the words that came from his mouth were the last she had expected. "I owe you an apology, Eliza, for subjecting you to this humiliation, for making you a character in a sordid drama you never auditioned for." She stood frozen as he continued, his voice rough with something that might have been shame. "I never loved Cassandra, if you can believe that. The affair was itself an escape from expectations I could not meet, from my father's shadow that stretched across every aspect of my existence, from myself and the fear of what I might become." The honesty in his words startled her into boldness, and she heard herself ask, "What are you running from now?" and watched something flicker in his grey eyes, some internal debate about how much truth he could bear to reveal. He gestured for her to sit, poured her a glass of wine with shaking hands, and then he spoke of things he had never voiced aloud, how his father's violence had not been merely emotional but physical, how Adrian still carried scars both visible and hidden, how he had spent his entire life terrified that such cruelty lived in his blood like an inherited disease waiting to manifest, how every relationship he had ever attempted had been poisoned by his certainty that he would eventually become the monster who had made his childhood a hell of fear and pain. Eliza listened to this raw confession, and when he finally fell silent, she shared her own pain in turn, speaking of the slow horror of watching her family's situation deteriorate, of her father's weakness and her mother's despair, of the sick resignation she had felt when Adrian's offer arrived, knowing she was being sold like property to save people who should have protected her, but instead had made her the sacrifice their circumstances required. They sat across the desk from each other, two people who had been brought together by scandal and necessity, recognizing in each other's eyes the same trapped desperation, the same resignation to circumstances beyond their control, the same fundamental loneliness of those who have learned not to expect comfort or understanding from the world. Adrian's hand moved across the desk toward hers, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin, and the air between them felt charged with possibility and terror in equal measure, and she understood that they were standing at a precipice, and the next word spoken would determine whether they fell or flew. The clock in the corner chimed the hour, breaking the spell, and Adrian withdrew his hand, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Perhaps we are both running, Eliza, but I find I am tired of the chase, and if you are willing, perhaps we might stop running and see what becomes of two people who stand still long enough to truly see each other." Something fundamental had shifted between them. Some wall had not fallen but had been deliberately lowered, and Eliza knew with absolute certainty that whatever their marriage had been before this moment, it would be something entirely different after, though neither of them yet possessed the courage to name what that difference might become. As spring arrived at Thornfield Manor, it brought with it a transformation so profound that even the stones of the house seemed to warm, as though the building itself had been holding its breath through the long winter and could finally exhale. And Eliza, who had spent weeks ordering bulbs and planning gardens with Mrs. Winters, watched with quiet satisfaction as daffodils and crocuses pushed through the earth in defiant bursts of yellow and purple, as the rose bushes she had pruned began to show the first tender green of new growth, as the grey landscape of winter gave way to the tentative promise of renewal. Adrian no longer merely encountered her by accident, but sought her company with deliberate intention, appearing at breakfast with questions about her plans for the day, suggesting with careful casualness that she might enjoy riding the estate's boundaries with him, and these morning rides became a routine that both anticipated, with an eagerness neither quite acknowledged, the two of them moving side by side through awakening fields. While he pointed out property markers and spoke of improvements, he was planning a new roof for the tenant cottages, repairs to the mill, better drainage for the eastern fields, and she noticed that every plan incorporated suggestions she had made, that he spoke of these projects not as his alone but as theirs, a genuine partnership developing in the space where cold formality had once reigned. The tenant families noticed the change in their lord, remarking to one another that the Viscount smiled, now sometimes, that he stopped to speak with them about their concerns rather than riding past with distant indifference, that he seemed to actually see them as people rather than merely obligations. And when Adrian and Eliza rode into the village one April morning with baskets of food and clothing for families struggling after a difficult winter, the grateful tears of a widow and the shy thanks of her children revealed what his months of isolation had hidden, that he had his mother's capacity for kindness when he allowed himself to exercise it. A little girl presented Eliza with a handful of wildflowers, purple violets clutched in a small dirty fist, and as Eliza knelt to accept them with genuine delight, Adrian watched from astride his horse with an expression he did not yet have the courage to name, something tender and wondering and terrified all at once, as though he were seeing something precious and breakable that he longed to protect but feared to touch lest he destroy it. That evening they walked together through the rose garden at twilight, the air sweet with the perfume of early blooms, and Adrian asked with uncharacteristic hesitancy, "Are you happy here, Eliza?" And she paused before answering, choosing her words with the care they deserved. "I have found unexpected contentment in this place, in this life, in—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish, and he completed the thought in a voice rough with emotion. "In each other, perhaps? I confess I have as well, more than I believed myself capable of feeling." Their hands brushed as they walked, and then his fingers deliberately intertwined with hers, and for several heartbeats they stood in the gathering dusk, simply holding hands like nervous adolescents, experiencing first affection, until Adrian abruptly pulled back, old terrors rising in his eyes like ghosts he could not banish. "I don't know how to do this. Eliza, I don't know how to be what you deserve. I will only hurt you. But she stepped closer, her free hand rising to touch his face with infinite gentleness, and her words cut through his fear with quiet conviction. "Then learn, Adrian. Learn with me, because I am not afraid of you. I am only afraid that you will let fear keep us both trapped in loneliness when we need not be alone anymore." The days following the garden conversation were marked by Adrian's visible internal struggle, his careful distance, a physical manifestation of the war between desire and fear being waged behind his grey eyes. Yet Eliza noticed with quiet satisfaction that he no longer retreated to London, no longer invented excuses to be anywhere but near her. Instead, orbiting her presence like a planet held by gravitational forces it could neither escape nor fully surrender to, and she found herself increasingly aware of his gaze following her movements across rooms, of the way his breath caught when their hands accidentally touched, of the hunger and terror mingled in equal measure in his expression when he thought himself unobserved. A rainy afternoon in late April found Eliza in the conservatory that had once been his mother's sanctuary, now restored to warmth and light under her direction, and standing before an easel with a palette in hand and paint staining her fingers as she worked to capture the play of grey light through rain-streaked glass onto the leaves of the lemon trees. Adrian's mother had planted decades ago This hobby she had kept hidden during the cold months now revealed as another layer of the woman he was slowly coming to know. And when she sensed his presence in the doorway, she turned to find him watching her with an expression of such naked longing that her heart stuttered in her chest. She invited him in with a gesture that felt weighted with significance beyond the simple words, offered to teach him the basic strokes and techniques, and when he crossed the threshold, it felt like the crossing of a far more important boundary. And then she was standing behind him, her hand guiding his on the brush, the warmth of his body against hers, and the scent of him soap and leather, and something uniquely Adrian filling her senses, until she felt almost dizzy with awareness, and his defenses crumbled in the quiet domesticity of the moment as he spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "I married you to silence, gossip, Eliza, but I stay for entirely different reasons." Her heart racing, she asked with careful precision, "What reasons?" and felt him tense against her, felt the war being waged in his body as he struggled to articulate feelings he had spent a lifetime suppressing. And she waited with patience, learned over these months of slow revelation, knowing he needed time to find words for truths he barely understood himself. The moment stretched between them like spun glass, beautiful and fragile, and about to either shatter or solidify into something permanent, when the butler's apologetic voice interrupted from the doorway, announcing unexpected guests. And Adrian stepped back from her as though burned, and she wanted to scream at the interruption, even as she recognized the necessity of composing herself before facing whoever had arrived. Lord Miles Blackwell swept into Thornfield Manor with his wife Caroline like fresh wind through stale air, his warmth and easy laughter such a stark contrast to Adrian's former coldness that Eliza could hardly believe they shared blood. And as Caroline charmed the household staff and Miles embraced his brother with genuine affection, Eliza observed the way Adrian's shoulders gradually relaxed, the way something guarded in his expression softened in his brother's presence, and she understood that here was someone who had survived the same brutal childhood and emerged capable of love, living proof that their father's cruelty was not an inescapable inheritance. That evening, she watched from the drawing-room doorway as the brothers sat together in Adrian's study, and though she could not hear their low-voiced conversation, she saw Miles gesture toward where she stood, saw Adrian shake his head in denial of something, saw Miles lean forward with intensity and speak words that made Adrian's face transform through a dozen emotions in as many seconds, and later Adrian told her in halting phrases that Miles had observed what Adrian himself had been too terrified to name. "You love her," Miles had said, and Adrian had denied it, and then admitted in a whisper, "I don't deserve to," and Miles had replied with words that now echoed in both their minds. "Deserve it by being worthy of it, Adrian. Be better than our father. Be the man she believes you capable of becoming." Miles's visit, which had begun with such warmth and promise, darkened on the second evening when he requested a private audience with Adrian and Eliza in the study, and the gravity in his expression, as they closed the door, transformed the comfortable room into something oppressive and close, and when he spoke, it was with the careful precision of a man delivering news he wished he did not have to share. Adrian's past was resurfacing in dangerous ways, the sins of their father reaching forward across the years like grasping fingers from beyond the grave. For the late Viscount had not merely been cruel within the walls of his home, but had extended that cruelty outward through financial manipulations and deliberate ruinations that had destroyed families and driven men to despair. Among those ruined had been a French émigré nobleman, Count Philippe Dumarche, whose family had fled the Revolution with what remained of their fortune, only to have it systematically stripped away by the elder Blackwell. Through investments the Count had been assured were sound, but which proved to be elaborate. Frauds, and the losses had led to deaths Dumarche's father, by his own hand, his mother and sister to illness born of poverty and despair, and now, Miles reported with evident concern, the Count had returned to England after years abroad, his intentions unclear, but his presence in London, noted by those who remembered the old scandal and whispered warnings to those who bore the Blackwell name. Adrian's face had gone pale as Miles spoke, his hands gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles showed white, and when he finally found his voice it was rough with an emotion Eliza recognized as fear not for himself but for her. He must hire additional security immediately, post guards at every entrance to the manor, ensure that Eliza is never left unprotected, and she felt her heart contract at the evidence of his first instinct, being her safety. This man who months ago would not have crossed a corridor to bid her good morning now, prepared to fortify his home like a castle under siege to keep her from harm. She insisted on understanding the full scope of the danger, refusing to be sheltered from truth like a child from nightmare, and Adrian, after a moment's visible struggle, told her everything, with a completeness that felt like the final wall between them, crumbling his father's schemes, detailed in all their calculated cruelty, the families destroyed, the blood on the Blackwell name that no amount of time could fully wash away, and his terror that by marrying her he had painted a target upon her back and made her vulnerable to vengeance meant for his father and for him as his father's heir. When he finished speaking, there was silence in the study, broken only by the crackling of the fire. And then Eliza rose and moved to stand before him, and her voice when she spoke carried the strength of iron wrapped in silk. "I am your wife, Adrian, your wife in truth. Now regardless of how this marriage began, and I will not hide or flee or pretend that the name I bear means nothing. We will face this together or not at all." The emotion that transformed his face was so overwhelming that for a moment she thought he might weep, and then his arms were around her, and he was holding her with desperate intensity, his face buried against her neck as though she were the only solid thing in a world gone uncertain. And Miles quietly excused himself to see to the hiring of additional men, leaving them alone in their fear and their fierce determination to protect what they had found in each other. That evening, long after Miles and Caroline had retired to their chambers, there came a soft knock at Eliza's door, and when she opened it, she found Adrian standing in the corridor with an expression so vulnerable that her breath caught, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper if he might simply be near her, to know that she was safe, and she stepped aside to let him enter this space he had not crossed since their wedding night, when he had deposited her there and walked away without a backward glance. They sat together by her fireplace as the hours passed, not touching beyond the occasional brush of shoulders, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Childhood memories of times before cruelty and responsibility had shaped them, dreams they had abandoned as impractical or impossible, new dreams tentatively forming in the space between them, and as dawn began to paint the sky beyond her windows, they were seated close together, her head resting on his shoulder and his hand gently stroking her hair, and there was no passionate declaration or dramatic gesture, only the deep comfort of true intimacy born of trust and shared vulnerability, and his whispered words as the sun rose carried a truth that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "I would not survive losing you, Eliza. I have only just learned how to live." The week that followed that dawn conversation in her chambers carried the peculiar quality of a held breath, as though the entire manor existed in suspension between revelation and consummation, and Eliza found herself acutely conscious of every glance Adrian sent her way, every accidental brush of hands that felt laden with significance, their relationship transformed into something undeniably intimate, yet still unconsummated, both of them circling the truth they had finally acknowledged, but uncertain how to proceed from admission to action, and the uncertainty itself held a sweetness that might have been unbearable, had it not been tempered by the increased security presence that served as constant reminder of the danger lurking beyond their walls. The investigation into Count Dumarche's whereabouts was proving frustratingly difficult, Miles's contacts in London reporting contradictory sightings and rumors that suggested either the Count was deliberately obscuring his movements or had left England entirely, and Adrian's protectiveness grew in inverse proportion to the certainty of threat, until he was barely letting Eliza from his sight, following her from room to room with an intensity that might have felt oppressive had she not recognized it as love, expressing itself in the only way he yet knew how, and she took to gently teasing him about his hovering presence, asking if he intended to accompany her to her bath or perhaps stand guard while she slept. In an effort to maintain some semblance of normalcy and to reassure the local society that all was well at Thornfield Manor, they held a garden party on a gloriously bright afternoon when the roses were at their peak, and the grounds had never looked more beautiful under Eliza's careful restoration, and the assembled guests could not help but remark upon the obvious affection between the Viscount and Viscountess, the way his eyes followed her movements across the lawn, the smile that transformed his formerly severe features when she laughed, the contrast to their wedding's cold formality so stark that it became the primary topic of whispered conversation among the ladies taking tea beneath the striped pavilion. Eliza wore a gown of rose-colored silk that caught the afternoon light and made her skin luminous, and Adrian found himself unable to look away, unable to focus on the conversations happening around him, because she filled his entire field of vision like the sun fills the sky. And when the musicians struck up a waltz and he claimed her hand for their first dance since the wedding, the electricity between them was palpable to every observer, their bodies moving together with an intimacy that spoke of far more than mere steps, and he leaned close to whisper in a voice rough with emotion, "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, Eliza," and her bold response, "Then stop treating me like spun glass, Adrian. I am stronger than you think," sent heat coursing through him that had nothing to do with the warm afternoon. That evening, after the last guests had departed and the manor had settled into quiet, Adrian wrestled with the internal debate that had plagued him for days, his unworthiness warring against his desperate need, his fear of becoming his father, battling his certainty that if he did not claim what they had found together, he would regret it for whatever remained of his life. And the decision, when it came, felt both terrifying and inevitable, and he sought her out in the drawing room, where she sat reading, and asked, with a formality that belied the trembling in his hands, if she would meet him in the library at midnight, and her agreement carried the weight of mutual understanding that this meeting would be significant, that whatever remained unspoken between them would finally find voice in the quiet hours when the rest of the world slept, while beyond the manor's walls in the darkness of the woods, a shadowy figure watched the lighted windows and whispered a vow of vengeance that would shatter their careful peace before another dawn could break. Midnight found the library transformed by shadows and firelight, the flames burning low in the hearth, so that the great room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, and when Eliza entered, she found Adrian standing by the tall window, overlooking the darkened grounds, every line of his body taut with tension, as though he were preparing for battle rather than conversation, and she felt her heart begin to race with the certain knowledge that whatever passed between them in this quiet hour would fundamentally alter the landscape of their marriage and their lives. He turned at the sound of her approach, and she saw that his carefully constructed composure was fracturing, saw in his grey eyes a tumult of emotion that made her breath catch, and when he tried to speak the rehearsed words he had clearly prepared, they failed him entirely, crumbling into raw honesty that bypassed eloquence for naked truth. "I do not know how to say this with the grace it deserves, Eliza. I, who have always prided myself on control, find that you have stripped every defense I ever built and left me vulnerable in ways I never thought possible, terrified in ways I cannot articulate." She remained still, afraid that any movement might shatter his fragile courage, and he continued in a voice that trembled with the weight of confession. "I love you. I have grown to love you with an intensity that terrifies me. I cannot imagine drawing breath in a world that does not contain you. You have become necessary to my existence in the way that air is necessary, light is necessary, hope is necessary, and every wall I built to protect myself from feeling what my father felt, from becoming what he became, and has crumbled under your patient grace like frost melting under spring Sunday." His hands clenched at his sides, as though he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her, and the words came faster now, desperate. "But I am terrified, Eliza, terrified that I carry his coldness in my blood, that I will hurt you as he hurt my mother, that I am unworthy of what you offer simply by existing in my presence, with your strength and your kindness, and your extraordinary capacity for forgiveness." She could bear his distance no longer and crossed the room to stand before him, her hands rising to frame his face and force him to meet her eyes, to see the truth she needed him to understand. And her voice, when she spoke, carried the steadiness of absolute certainty. "I prepared myself to endure a loveless marriage, Adrian. I armored my heart against years of loneliness and convinced myself that duty would be enough to sustain me. But instead of the cold stranger I expected, I found a man worth loving, a man I do love with everything I am, a man who is nothing like his father because he fears becoming him, because he fights every day to choose warmth over coldness, connection over isolation." His expression transformed into something between disbelief and desperate hope, and his voice broke on the question, "You love me?" as though these were words he had never imagined speaking, and her simple "yes" shattered his last restraint, and he pulled her against him with a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, or both, and then his mouth found hers in a kiss that carried months of accumulated longing, tender at first as though she might break, then deepening into passion as she pressed closer and showed him without words that she would not break, that she was strong enough for both of them. They broke apart only to breathe, foreheads pressed together, and the words tumbled between them in whispered fragments. "I love you, and I will spend every day of my life earning this," and her fierce response, "You already have. You already have." And the kiss that followed was deeper still, years of loneliness melting away in the heat of finally acknowledged desire. And when she looked at him with invitation clear in her eyes, and he asked with careful formality that barely masked his trembling need, "Are you certain, Eliza?" Her certainty blazed like fire. "I have never been more certain of anything." And they moved together toward the door, toward her chambers, toward the consummation that would finally make their marriage true in every sense. But before they reached the threshold, a tremendous crash echoed from somewhere in the manor's depths, followed by shouting and the unmistakable sound of steel meeting steel. And Adrian's transformation was instantaneous, every tender line of his body hardening into lethal purpose as he pushed her behind him and commanded in a voice that brooked no argument, "Stay behind me, stay close, do exactly as I say." Adrian pushed Eliza behind him with a hand that trembled not with fear but with protective fury, and they moved together into the corridor where chaos had erupted through the midnight quiet of Thornfield Manor, like violence tearing through silk, the sounds of struggle echoing from multiple directions as armed intruders dressed in dark clothing clashed with the security guards Adrian had hired. And the clash of steel meeting steel sent ice through Eliza's veins, even as she felt the solid warmth of Adrian's body before her, shielding her from whatever horror approached. His mind worked with tactical precision, despite the circumstances, assessing their options in the span of heartbeats they needed to reach his study, where weapons were stored, or barricade themselves in a defensible room until reinforcements could arrive. But the choice was stolen from them when an attacker appeared at the corridor's end, blade gleaming in the lamplight, and Adrian shoved Eliza toward the nearest doorway, even as he moved to engage the man with nothing but his bare hands and the desperate need to keep her safe. She watched in mingled terror and awe as Adrian revealed skills she had never suspected. Boxing and fencing techniques learned not for sport, but as defense against his father's violence, and he moved with lethal grace that spoke of years of practice, disarming the attacker with a swift combination of strikes that left the man unconscious on the floor. But there was no time for relief, because more footsteps were approaching, and Adrian grabbed her hand, and they ran through the familiar corridors, made strange by darkness and danger, reaching his study, where he immediately armed himself with a sword from the wall display and a pistol from the locked drawer, and then he turned to her and pressed a smaller blade into her shaking hands, his grey eyes burning with intensity as he gave instructions that brooked no argument. "If anyone but me comes through that door, Eliza, you use this. Do you understand? Anyone but me." She nodded, though her hands trembled so badly she could barely grip the weapon, and then, despite the urgency of their situation, he paused to kiss her hard and desperately, pouring months of emotion into that single moment of connection, and his voice broke as he whispered against her lips, "I love you. Remember that. Whatever happens, remember that I love you." And then he was gone, locking her in from outside, and she heard his footsteps running back toward the sounds of fighting, leaving her alone with nothing but the blade in her hands and the muffled chaos beyond the door. Minutes passed like hours while she stood frozen in the center of the study, her terror for Adrian overwhelming any fear she felt for herself, and she strained to make sense of the sounds filtering through the heavy wood shouts and crashes. The report of a pistol, a cry of pain that might have been Adrian's, and made her heart stop until she heard his voice commanding someone to surrender. Then came a different sound, one that made her blood run cold, the careful, methodical sound of someone working at the study lock with tools rather than force, the patient approach of someone who had all the time in the world, and Eliza gripped the blade with both hands and backed toward the window, watching the door handle with the fixed attention of prey watching a predator approach. The lock clicked open with terrible finality, and the door swung wide to reveal not one of the hired assassins, but Count Dumarche himself, dressed with elegant formality even in the midst of violence, his blade drawn and his aristocratic features arranged in an expression of cold satisfaction as he stepped into the study and closed the door behind him with careful deliberation, and his voice when he spoke carried the cultured tones of French nobility, underlaid with poison. "Lady Blackwell, how unfortunate that we must meet under such circumstances. I am Count Henri Dumarche, and I have come to collect a debt your husband's family owes to mine, paid not in coin but in blood and grief. For his father destroyed everything I loved, and now I shall return the favor by taking everything he loves." Eliza felt her fear transmute into defiance, her chin lifting as she met his cold eyes and spoke with a steadiness that surprised her. "You will have to go through me first, and I promise you that will not be as easy as you imagine." But Dumarche only smiled with terrible patience and advanced toward her with his blade raised, and she knew with sickening certainty that her small weapon and untrained hands would not be enough to stop what was coming. Dumarche moved toward Eliza with lethal intent written in every deliberate step, his blade catching the lamplight as he advanced, and she forced herself into a defensive stance, though her hands trembled and her heart hammered against her ribs with the certain knowledge that her small weapon and untrained hands would be no match for his practiced skill. But she would not die cowering, would not give him the satisfaction of her terror, even as he began to speak in that cultured voice now edged with bitter satisfaction. "Your husband's father took everything from me, Lady Blackwell, my estates, my fortune, my family's honor, and when my sister could not bear the shame of our ruin, she took her own life. So you must understand that this is justice, that the sins of the father must be visited upon the son, and what better vengeance than to take from Adrian Blackwell what he has clearly come to treasure above all else." Eliza found her voice despite her fear and spoke with defiance that surprised even herself. "Adrian is not his father. He has spent his entire life trying to be better than the man who sired him, and if you cannot see the difference, then your grief has made you as monstrous as the late Viscount ever was." But Dumarche's expression remained cold as winter stone, and he lunged forward with sudden violence, his blade slicing through the air toward her heart, and she barely managed to dodge so that the steel caught her arm instead, cutting through silk and skin, and the sharp bloom of pain tore a cry from her throat, even as blood spread across the rose-colored fabric in a widening stain. Her cry carried through the manor like a bell of alarm, and she stumbled backward toward the window, her small blade raised in trembling defense, while Dumarche advanced with terrible patience and raised his weapon for a killing blow. But before it could fall, the study door exploded inward with such force that it crashed against the wall, and Adrian appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with eyes gone wild. Eliza, bleeding, Dumarche's blade raised, the tableau of imminent murder, and the sound that tore from his throat was something between a roar and a scream, pure rage and terror given voice, as he charged across the room with desperate speed. Dumarche pivoted at the last moment, redirecting his thrust from Eliza toward this new threat. But Adrian's momentum was unstoppable, and in the heartbeat, before the blade could pierce his chest, he threw himself between them, his body becoming a shield for the woman he loved, and the steel that had been aimed at Eliza's heart plunged instead into his shoulder, driving deep, and his grunt of pain was followed by the hot spread of blood across his white shirt. But even wounded, his protective fury did not falter, and he crashed into Dumarche with the full force of his weight, both men going down in a tangle of limbs, while Adrian's fists drove into the Count's face again and again, with strength born of desperation. Eliza screamed and rushed forward just as the manor security finally burst through the door, pulling Adrian off Dumarche, even as the Count was subdued and disarmed. And Adrian swayed on his feet, his face gone pale as parchment, blood loss beginning to exact its terrible toll. But his eyes found Eliza's, and held them as she caught him in her arms and lowered him carefully to the floor, her hands pressing against his wound in a futile attempt to stem the crimson flow, and her voice broke on the words, "Don't you dare leave me! Don't you dare, Adrian! Stay with me! Please stay with me!" His pale lips curved in the ghost of a smile, and he raised one trembling hand to touch her face, leaving a streak of his own blood across her cheek, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Had to. You're everything. Had to keep you safe." And then his eyes fluttered closed despite her desperate pleas, and his hand fell slack, consciousness abandoning him to darkness, while Eliza clutched him and screamed for the physician, her tears falling onto his blood-stained shirt, as the household erupted into organized chaos around them. The physician arrived within the hour and worked with grim efficiency, while Eliza hovered nearby, refusing to leave Adrian's side despite her own injury. Her arm hastily bandaged by the housekeeper, while the doctor focused on the Viscount's far more serious wound, extracting the blade's remnants and stitching the torn flesh with careful precision, and his pronouncement when he finally straightened was cautiously optimistic. The wound was serious but had missed the major vessels, and if infection could be prevented, then Adrian would likely survive, though the coming days would be critical as fever and blood loss took their toll. Miles arrived at dawn, having been summoned by urgent messenger, his face drawn with worry that transformed to profound relief when he learned his brother yet lived. And his wife Caroline immediately took charge of the household, with quiet competence, ensuring the staff maintained order, while Eliza kept her vigil at Adrian's bedside in a chair drawn so close that she could hold his hand and watch every shallow rise and fall of his chest, and she sat there through the long hours that turned to days, while fever set in as the physician had warned it might, Adrian's skin burning beneath her touch as he tossed restlessly and muttered delirious fragments of memory calls for his mother, apologies to Eliza, broken phrases about blades and blood, and the desperate need to keep her safe. She never left him, her own pain ignored as she pressed cool cloths to his forehead and whispered constant reassurances that she was there, she was safe, he had saved her, and now she would not abandon him, her hand always in his, even when exhaustion pulled her into brief periods of unconsciousness, and the servants whispered among themselves about their master's courage, how he had thrown himself before the blade without a moment's hesitation, and about their mistress's devotion as she nursed him through the dangerous days with a fierce determination that would not countenance the possibility of his death. The third night brought the crisis, Adrian's fever climbing to dangerous heights, while Eliza prayed with a desperation she had never known. But as dawn broke, the fever finally broke as well, his temperature dropping and his breathing easing into natural sleep rather than delirious unconsciousness. And when his eyes finally opened in the grey morning light, they found Eliza asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still clutching his, her face marked by the tears and exhaustion of 3 days' vigil, and his weak movement to touch her face woke her instantly. Her eyes flew open, and for a heartbeat, she simply stared at him as though afraid he might be a fever dream of her own exhausted mind. But then, overwhelming relief crashed through her, and tears flowed freely as she leaned forward to press her forehead against their joined hands, and his voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "You stayed," and her response came choked with emotion. "Where else would I be?" Adrian's eyes filled with tears at her constancy. This woman, who had every reason to resent him for the danger he had brought into her life, and he tried to apologize, to express his regret for subjecting her to such terror, but Eliza lifted her head and met his gaze with fierce intensity. "You saved my life, Adrian. You threw yourself between me and death without hesitation, so do not apologize for the consequences of your courage." And his pale lips curved in the ghost of a smile as he whispered, "We're even then, because you saved mine first, long before tonight. You saved me from the cold prison I had built around my heart." The weeks that followed Adrian's awakening were marked by a slow but steady recovery, though the physician insisted he remain abed for at least a fortnight to allow the wound to properly heal, and Eliza appointed herself his constant companion, much to the amusement of Miles and Caroline, who tactfully took their leave after the first week. Miles departing with a knowing smile and a quiet word to his brother that some good had come from this terrible affair after all, for Adrian's walls had finally crumbled entirely, and the love between the Viscount and Viscountess was now evident to anyone with eyes to see. Eliza read to Adrian during the long afternoon hours, her voice painting stories across the sunlit chamber, and they talked as they had never talked before, with complete honesty and vulnerability, sharing every fear and hope and dream they had harbored in secret, and Adrian spoke at length about his childhood, the violence that had marked his early years, his mother's desperate attempts to shield him, her death that had left him alone with a monster, and the walls he had built stone by stone to survive his father's cruelty, walls that Eliza had dismantled with nothing more than patience and genuine care. And he wept as he spoke, the tears of a man finally allowing himself to feel after years of deliberate numbness. Eliza shared her own buried pain, The humiliation of being bartered like cattle to save her family, her terror on their wedding night that she would spend the rest of her life invisible to the man she had married, her slow realization that beneath his ice lay a man of profound depth and unexpected kindness, and her growing love that had frightened her because she had believed it could never be returned. And now Adrian pulled her close despite the protest of his healing shoulder and whispered against her hair that he had been a fool, that he had wasted months they could have spent in happiness, and she told him gently that no time had been wasted, that slow growth had deep roots, and they had built something real and lasting precisely because it had not come easily. As Adrian's strength returned, he began to walk the manor corridors with Eliza's support, and the household staff watched with undisguised joy as their master and mistress moved through the halls hand in hand, pausing to speak warmly with every servant they encountered. And Mrs. Winters remarked to the cook that the manor had not felt so warm and alive since the late Viscountess's time, before the old lord's darkness had descended, and now it seemed a new era had begun, one marked by love rather than coldness, connection rather than isolation, and everyone from the lowest scullery maid to the butler felt the transformation in the very air they breathed. Count Dumarche had been taken to London to face justice for his crimes, and word came that he would likely hang for attempted murder, and while Eliza felt a measure of pity for the man's tragic losses, she could not regret the outcome, for he had made his choices just as Adrian had made different ones, and Adrian himself said quietly that he hoped Dumarche found peace in whatever came next, but that peace could not be built on vengeance, only on the harder work of forgiveness, and choosing to be better than those who had wronged us. And Eliza loved him all the more for that grace, for his determination to break the cycle of violence and hatred that had marked his family line and create something new and good from the ashes of the past. 1 month after the attack found Adrian restored to full health, the wound in his shoulder healing cleanly and leaving only a scar that he wore with quiet pride, for it was a mark of his love and his willingness to sacrifice everything for Eliza, and she often traced its edges with gentle fingers in the privacy of their shared chambers, marveling that this man who had once seemed carved from ice now burned with such fierce devotion that he had placed his body between her and death without a moment's hesitation. Their marriage, which had begun as a cold transaction conducted in mutual desperation, had been transformed into something neither had dared to dream possible, a union built on genuine love, hard-won trust, and the kind of deep understanding that comes only from walking through fire together and emerging on the other side, not merely intact, but strengthened by the ordeal. Adrian no longer retreated to his own wing at night, but shared Eliza's chambers, their union finally consummated in tenderness and passion, and the household staff smiled knowingly when they saw the Viscount emerge each morning with his wife's hand in his, both wearing expressions of such contentment that it seemed to cast light through the corridors that had once been shrouded in coldness and grief. The manor itself reflected the transformation, for Eliza had continued her work of breathing warmth back into every room, filling vases with fresh flowers, ordering new draperies in cheerful colors, and ensuring that fires burned bright in every hearth. And Adrian supported every change with enthusiasm, telling her that she had made this house a home in the truest sense, a place of refuge and joy, rather than the prison of painful memories it had been for so long. They spent their days in genuine partnership, riding the estate together each morning and working side by side to improve the lives of their tenants, and Adrian often remarked with wonder that Eliza had taught him what it meant to be a good steward of the land and the people who depended upon him, her compassion and practical wisdom making him a better man and a better lord than he had ever thought himself capable of becoming. In the evenings they retreated to the library where their relationship had slowly unfolded across so many quiet conversations, and they would sit together, reading or simply talking, sharing thoughts and dreams with the easy intimacy of two souls who had found in each other what they had always needed but never expected to receive. And sometimes Adrian would simply watch Eliza in the firelight, overwhelmed by gratitude that this extraordinary woman had been patient enough to see past his defenses to the man beneath, and had loved that man despite all his flaws and fears and the danger his family name had brought into her life. One evening, as autumn began to paint the trees in shades of amber and crimson, Adrian took Eliza's hand and led her to the portrait gallery where his mother's painted eyes still watched over the manor with gentle wisdom And he stood before that portrait with Eliza at his side and spoke to the image as though his mother could hear him, telling her that he had finally understood what she had tried to teach him through her example, that love required courage, that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness, and that choosing to open one's heart, despite the risk of pain, was the only way to truly live rather than merely exist in cold isolation. And he introduced Eliza as the woman who had saved him from the darkness, the woman who had shown him that he was not doomed to repeat his father's cruelty, but could instead create something new and beautiful from the ashes of the past. Eliza's tears fell like rain upon Adrian's upturned face as she listened to him speak to his mother's portrait, her heart swelling with such profound love that she thought it might burst from her chest, and when he turned to her with eyes bright with unshed tears of his own, she drew him close and told him that she was honored to be part of this family's healing, that together they would create the kind of home his mother had dreamed of, a place of warmth and laughter and love, and Adrian held her as though she were the most precious thing in all the world, which to him she absolutely was, and they stood together in the portrait gallery until the last light faded from the windows and the shadows grew long around them, bound together not by the cold contract that had brought them to the altar, but by something far stronger and more enduring, a love forged in patience, tempered in adversity, and proven in the moment when death came calling, and he had chosen without hesitation to place his body between danger and her heart. The following weeks brought news that filled them both with quiet satisfaction, for word arrived that Adrian's testimony about his father's crimes had been instrumental in settling old debts with several families the late Viscount had wronged, and Adrian had insisted on making restitution from his own fortune to those who had suffered, determined to clear the family name, not through denial or evasion, but through honest acknowledgement and tangible amends, and Eliza watched with pride as her husband systematically dismantled the legacy of cruelty and replaced it with one of honor, and the local gentry who had once whispered about the cold Viscount Blackwell now spoke of him with respect and genuine affection, marveling at the transformation that love had wrought in a man they had thought irredeemable. As autumn deepened into early winter, Eliza discovered with joy and some trepidation that she was with child, and when she told Adrian the news in the privacy of their chambers, his response was one of such overwhelming emotion that he wept openly, kneeling before her and pressing his face against her still flat belly, whispering promises to their unborn child that he would be nothing like his own father, that he would be gentle and kind and present, that he would love this child and its mother with every breath in his body, and Eliza ran her fingers through his dark hair and told him with absolute certainty that she had no doubts about the kind of father he would be, for she had watched him transform from ice to warmth, from isolation to connection, and if he could accomplish that miracle, he could accomplish anything. The manor prepared for the coming edition with barely contained excitement, Mrs. Winters personally overseeing the preparation of the nursery that had once been Adrian's own, and the servants worked with genuine joy to restore the room that had been closed since his childhood, painting the walls in soft colors and acquiring every comfort that might be needed. And Adrian stood in the doorway watching the transformation and told Eliza that he could scarcely believe that this room, which had witnessed so much of his own pain, would now house their child's happiness, that they were truly rewriting the story of this family from one of darkness into one of light. As spring softened into the fullness of summer, Eliza's pregnancy became evident to all who saw her, her figure rounding with the promise of new life, and Adrian's devotion grew even more tender and attentive, if such a thing were possible, for he seemed to view her with a mixture of reverence and wonder, as though she were performing some miracle beyond his comprehension, which in truth she was, for she carried within her the living symbol of their transformed love, the child who would be born not into coldness and cruelty as he had been, but into warmth and devotion, and the kind of security that comes from being deeply wanted by both parents. The summer days passed in gentle contentment, Adrian insisting that Eliza rest frequently, though she protested that she was perfectly capable of continuing her usual activities, and their compromise was that he would accompany her on shortened walks through the gardens, where roses bloomed in riotous profusion, and the air hummed with the drowsy sound of bees moving from blossom to blossom, and they would sit together on the bench beneath the old oak tree, where he would read aloud to her from whatever book had captured their interest that week, his hand resting protectively on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement that still amazed him each time their child stirred. Mrs. Winters and the household staff prepared for the birth with the kind of joyful anticipation that had been absent from Thornfield Manor for more years than anyone could remember, and the contrast between the cold, lifeless place it had been when Eliza first arrived and the warm, vibrant home it had become was remarked upon by everyone who visited, for love had indeed transformed these halls more thoroughly than any amount of new furnishings or fresh paint could have accomplished. The very atmosphere charged with hope and happiness, where once there had been only echoes of old sorrows. On a warm afternoon in late August, as golden light streamed through the windows of their shared chambers, Eliza's pains began, and Adrian's careful composure fractured into barely concealed panic, despite the midwife's assurances that all was proceeding normally, and he refused to be banished from the room as tradition dictated, instead remaining at Eliza's side throughout the long hours of labor, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, even as she gripped his fingers hard enough to leave marks, and cried out with pain that he would have taken upon himself if such a thing were possible. The moment their daughter entered the world with a furious wail of protest at the indignity of birth, Adrian wept without shame, overcome by emotions too powerful for words as the midwife placed the tiny, perfect child in Eliza's exhausted arms, and he looked upon his wife and daughter with an expression of such profound love and gratitude that the midwife herself found tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, for she had attended many births in her long career, but rarely had she witnessed such pure joy as radiated from the Viscount in that sacred moment. They named her Catherine, after Adrian's mother, and as he held his daughter for the first time, feeling the impossible lightness of her in his arms and seeing Eliza's tired but radiant smile, he made a silent vow to the memory of the woman whose portrait watched over them all that he would be the father his own had never been, that this child would know only love and gentleness and the security of parents who cherished each other and her with their whole hearts, and that the cycle of pain that had haunted the Blackwell family for generations would end with him, transformed by the extraordinary woman who had seen past his frozen exterior to the man beneath and loved him into becoming someone worthy of that love. As summer gave way to autumn once more, the anniversary of their wedding approached, and Adrian found himself reflecting with something approaching awe on the transformation that a single year had wrought. For the cold, bitter man who had married Eliza out of social necessity barely resembled the person he had become, and when he mentioned this to his wife one evening, as they sat together in the nursery watching Catherine sleep in her cradle, Eliza smiled and reminded him that the capacity for warmth and love had always existed within him. She had simply helped him remember how to access it, and he pulled her close and told her that she was far too generous in her assessment, for without her patience and steadfast affection he would have remained frozen in his father's shadow for the remainder of his days, a living monument to cruelty and isolation rather than the husband and father he had somehow been given the grace to become. The anniversary itself dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for celebration, and Adrian had arranged a surprise for Eliza, refusing to tell her anything except that she should dress for travel, and when the carriage arrived, she found it laden with trunks and provisions for a journey. And Adrian handed her up with a mysterious smile, and told her only that they were going somewhere he should have taken her a year ago. And as they traveled through the countryside with Catherine sleeping peacefully in Eliza's arms, she eventually recognized the road leading to her family's estate. The modest manor, where she had grown up before financial ruin and marriage to a viscount, had altered the course of her life forever. Her parents met them in the drive with expressions of joy and relief, for though Adrian had sent regular financial support to restore their circumstances and had written cordial letters, he and Eliza had not visited due to his recovery and then Catherine's birth, and now as Eliza's mother embraced her daughter and exclaimed over her beautiful granddaughter, Adrian found himself drawn aside by Eliza's father, Lord Hartwood, who regarded him with an expression of grave assessment before speaking words that struck directly to Adrian's heart, thanking him not merely for the financial assistance that had saved the family from ruin, but more importantly for making his daughter happy, for it was evident in every letter she wrote, and in the glow that now radiated from her, that she had found not just security but genuine love in her marriage, and Adrian found his throat tight with emotion as he assured his father-in-law that Eliza had saved him far more than he could ever save her, that she had taken a man locked in ice and taught him how to feel warmth again. And Lord Hartwood clasped his shoulder with the kind of paternal affection Adrian's own father had never shown, and told him that he was grateful beyond words, that his daughter's sacrifice had transformed into something beautiful. The days spent at the Hartwood estate passed in gentle contentment, Eliza reunited with her younger siblings, who were now thriving thanks to the restoration of the family's fortunes, and Adrian watched as she laughed and played with them in the gardens where she had spent her own childhood, and he was struck once again by how much he owed this extraordinary woman, for she had agreed to marry a cold stranger to save these people she loved, had walked into a loveless arrangement with courage and dignity, and had somehow found it within herself to love the broken man she found waiting in that cold manner. And when she caught him watching her with that expression of wonder, she came to him and took his hand and asked him what he was thinking, and he told her truthfully that he was thinking how impossible it seemed that she was his, that he had been granted the privilege of calling her his wife and the mother of his child, and she kissed him there in front of her family and told him that she would choose him again and again, in every lifetime, in every circumstance, for he was the greatest gift she had ever received, even when he had first appeared as an unwelcome burden. The return journey to Thornfield Manor found them travelling in companionable silence, Catherine drowsing peacefully in her mother's arms as the carriage wheels rolled over familiar roads, and Adrian reached across the space between them to take Eliza's free hand in his, marvelling, as he often did, at how natural such gestures had become, when once he would have recoiled from any touch that spoke of genuine affection, and she smiled at him with that expression of infinite tenderness that still had the power to stop his breath in his chest, for he knew he would never take for granted the extraordinary grace of being loved by this woman. And as the manor came into view in the distance, its windows gleaming gold in the afternoon light, he was struck by how the building itself seemed transformed, no longer the cold mausoleum of his childhood, but a true home filled with warmth and laughter and the daily evidence of love made manifest in countless small acts of devotion and care. That evening, after Catherine had been settled in the nursery and they had shared a quiet dinner, Adrian led Eliza up to the portrait gallery where his mother's image watched over the hall with her gentle smile, and he stood before it with his arm around his wife's waist and spoke aloud to the painted face, telling the woman who had tried so hard to protect him from his father's cruelty that she would have loved Eliza, that she would have rejoiced to see the happiness that now filled these halls, and that her granddaughter would grow up knowing the stories of her kindness and grace, so that her memory would live on through generations, unmarked by the darkness that had consumed her husband. And Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder and added her own quiet promise to the portrait, that she would honor the legacy of love this woman had tried to preserve even in the darkest times, and together they stood in silent communion with the past, while the future grew peacefully in the nursery down the hall. The months that followed established a rhythm to their lives that felt both extraordinary in its happiness and comfortingly domestic in its daily patterns, for Adrian had discovered that true contentment was found not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of ordinary moments made precious by love, in morning walks with his wife, while their daughter gurgled happily in her perambulator, in evenings spent reading aloud, while Eliza worked at her embroidery and the fire crackled companionably in the hearth, in the profound intimacy of lying beside her each night and waking each morning to find her still there, solid and real, and his in ways he had never imagined possible during those first cold months of their marriage, when he had been too frozen in his father's shadow to recognize the gift he had been given. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the second anniversary of their wedding, Adrian found himself reflecting on the man he had been 2 years prior, that bitter and isolated creature who had married a stranger to silence gossip and had been too blind to see that he was binding himself to his own salvation, and the distance between that man and who he had become seemed vast and unbridgeable, as though they were two entirely different people connected only by name and circumstance. And when he mentioned this thought to Eliza one evening as they prepared for bed, she reminded him gently that the capacity for change had always existed within him, that she had not created his better nature, but simply provided the safety and patience necessary for him to discover it himself, though he argued with tender insistence that without her steadfast love he would have remained locked in ice until it killed him. And she kissed him then and told him that perhaps they should simply agree that they had saved each other and leave the accounting of debts unpaid to those who believed love could be measured in such terms. Dear listener, in this transformation, from cold arrangement to profound devotion, there exists a truth that speaks to the redemptive power of patience and the extraordinary courage required to remain open to love, even when circumstances seem designed to preclude it. For Eliza might have hardened her heart against the man who married her for convenience, might have retreated into bitterness and resentment at being treated as a solution to a social problem rather than a person worthy of respect and affection. Yet she chose instead to meet his coldness with steady warmth, to respond to his withdrawal with gentle persistence, to see beneath the frozen exterior to the wounded man beneath, and to believe that he was capable of transformation even when he had ceased to believe it himself. There is wisdom here for all who find themselves in circumstances that feel limiting or loveless, for we cannot always control the situations into which life places us, but we retain always the choice of how we respond to them, whether we allow hardship to calcify our hearts, or whether we maintain the vulnerable courage to remain open to possibility, to continue extending grace even when it seems undeserved, to plant seeds of kindness in frozen ground and trust that spring will eventually come. Adrian's journey from isolation to connection reminds us that we are not condemned to repeat the patterns we inherit, that the sins and sorrows of previous generations need not define our own paths, and that with sufficient courage and the support of those who believe in our better nature, we can break free from even the most deeply entrenched cycles of pain and become something new, something worthy of the love we receive. May you find in your own life the courage to remain soft in hard circumstances, the patience to tend relationships that begin in difficulty, and the grace to recognize that redemption comes not in dramatic revelations, but in the accumulation of small choices made daily toward love rather than fear, toward connection rather than isolation, toward the hope that we are all capable of becoming better than we have been, and may you rest peacefully in the knowledge that transformation is always possible for those willing to undertake the vulnerable work of opening frozen hearts to warmth. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that love can indeed transform even the coldest of circumstances into something beautiful and warm and worth the risk of believing.